Hello everyone, Randy here for another PC build. This time we are building roughly a $600 to $700 PC here. For those of you who've been watching this series, we started out with our $300 PC. Definitely a little bit lower end there. You know, had the old spinning platter hard drive on it. A couple gigs of RAM, well 8 gigs of RAM to be precise. Definitely a smaller graphics card. Just generally smaller components together, but I think that computer performed quite well. Next, we stepped it up to $500 PC there, and there's actually not a whole lot that has changed from that PC to this PC. One major exception there, of course. And then again, that computer I think performed quite well. Definitely a good, solid gaming computer. Of course, you know, there's obviously better, but $500. Most of the equipment on that I do believe was used. So yeah, there is that, of course, used versus new. There's always some concern with that. This build here, again, like I said, about, I didn't add it up exactly. I think we're looking right around $650 here. Most of this is new, so that is good. The one exception here is the motherboard. So for those of you who watched a while back, I did a server replacement there. I replaced my server, that's what I call it. It's just a computer I use at home here that pretty much handles all the storage for me, as well as runs our Minecraft server here on the RDL and TeamSpeak there. So that's what runs that. I replaced that with an Intel-based system, Intel 8700K, 64 gigs of RAM. You know, pretty much a really nice system there. Got a bunch of storage on it, which hopefully in the future I do need to upgrade my storage, so you'll probably be seeing some storage upgrades here in the future here. But anyway, this is the old motherboard, CPU, and RAM off that system. So it's an old 8350 or 8530, 8350. I forget the exact numbers on that CPU. 8 cores at 4 gigahertz. So it's actually the same CPU as our $500 system. A much bigger motherboard though. So we'll get out the motherboard here. This is the Gigabyte GA990FX UD5. So hopefully you can see, like I said, a lot larger motherboard here. Got a lot of ports on it. Yeah, you can really cram some stuff on this board here. So CPU's already installed there, and I believe this is 16 gigs of DDR3 RAM. So we got some pretty good RAM in there. Set that off to the side here just a moment here so I can show you folks the rest. Cooler, same one as I used on the $500 PC here. Again, just a nice, not overly expensive, but I've never used one of these myself personally, but from what everybody says, they're really, really good. So that's that. Power supply here, we got an EVGA 600 watt. This is a refurbished power supply, so it's not new, but it's refurbished, so not exactly used either. This cooler, by the way, is new as well. Windows 10 again, that here right off the top, $80. Not much you can do about that. Motherboard and CPU and RAM here, just going with what the previous system cost was, the $500 PC. I think it was $200 to acquire the motherboard, the CPU, and the 16 gigs of RAM. So I'm just going to figure we'll call that $200 there. I think this is $30 for the Coolmaster cooler. The 600 watt power supply was $30. So I don't know about you folks, but I thought that was a whale of a deal. Got that off eBay there. Actually, I picked up 2 of those. They had, I forget, like 10 of them on sale or something. So it's like I bought 2 just so I can have a spare on hand as well. Or maybe for future computer builds. Stay tuned, we might be doing more. So Windows 10 there, like I said, $80. SSD. That's probably one of the bigger changes with this one. We're going only an SSD in here. It is only 500 gig, but at least in my experience, that's all I run in my system, and that's all I have ever needed. So, but keep in mind, I don't use my system for storage, so I don't store anything on my SSD. I have a second spinning platter, I think it's a 3 terabyte hard drive that I store data, especially as far as like videos and stuff go. And then, of course, the most important part of any gaming computer, the graphics card. So this one, GTX 1060. Our hard drive here, or SSD here, $100 for the SSD, 500 gig SSD there. Should be pretty good on the speed. I forget what the specs were here. Yeah, of course, I don't say in the box. But anyway, GTX 1060, this is the 3 gig edition. If you know your graphics cards, you know they also make a 6 gig edition. Same performance, the difference is just more memory. And it's not really that critical unless you're going to, like, say, maybe do 4K gaming. So unless you plan on doing 4K, 1063 gig is pretty much sufficient. And yeah, again, this computer's going to be for a giveaway, so stay tuned. The giveaway will probably be on Twitch here in a couple of weeks, depending on when this video posts. But make sure you stay tuned to the channel there. I'll make sure we announce it here. So anyway, GTX, this is an Asus GTX 1060 3 gig edition. It is the overclocked edition, it says, so that should be a really nice graphics card. For those, I know I get asked quite a bit, what computer would I recommend? Well, this here is probably about pretty close to what I would recommend. For graphics cards, I always recommend a GTX 1060. Of course, if you can afford more, definitely. Nothing's going to hurt with going to a bigger graphics card. Solid state hard drive there, cannot go wrong with that. Definitely a big speed increase with modern systems. Windows 10, not much to say about that. CPU processor, again, not as critical for gaming. Ideally, I would recommend a quad core and get as high a core clock as you can possibly get. The higher the gigahertz, typically the better the game is going to perform. That's probably a common misconception here, and I've been asked that a couple times. Well, hey, Core i9, that should make a great gaming CPU, right? And it does, but as far as I know, the Intel 8700K still outperforms the i9s, simply because it has a higher core clock, not core count, clock. So again, the clock speed, the gigahertz, is technically, at least at this point, more important for gaming than the number of cores and the actual overall CPU performance. For those who don't know, most games can only take advantage of one core. So I mean they will only run on one core of your CPU. So therefore having the highest core clock is the most important. Anyway, you folks are probably waiting for us to start building here. Probably going to do like a voiceover of the build here. Going to do this one a little bit different just to mix up the video style. So enjoy the build. Okay, so let's start building here. Going to be starting by putting the CPU in here, and if you've never put a CPU in, typically they'll have a corner marked with which direction they go. Never ever want to force a CPU in. And if you notice the difference there between typically Intel and AMD, on AMD the pins are on the CPU, Intel the pins are in the socket, so a little bit opposite there. Just looking at the motherboard here. Unfortunately, I missed the clip of putting the RAM in. I must have forgot to push record on that, but we got 16 gigs of RAM there, populating all 4 slots. I believe that's the max this motherboard can support, by the way. Basically, with the RAM there, you just put the RAM sticks in, push them down until the locking clips click into place, and then you're done. Next, putting on the CPU cooler here. If you watched my previous $500 PC build there, this is going to be the same cooler as that one. Fairly easy design, reusing the back plate here that comes with the motherboard here again. The screws that come with this cooler just screw right down into that, so I see no reason to replace that back plate. There is a back plate that is included with the kit, so if your back plate doesn't work or you don't have one, you can use that. The whole idea behind a back plate, by the way, is to make sure you evenly spread the load on the motherboard. You definitely want to use a back plate if you can. You don't want to be putting uneven load on the motherboard, potentially stressing it, or even breaking it. Next, putting on a nice layer of, or at least trying to put on a nice layer of thermal grease here, or thermal compound. I don't know why, but this CPU did not want to stick to the CPU very well for some reason. I don't know if maybe it's because it was already applied at one time, but just trying to get a nice even coat onto there. And then once I get the cooler, I kind of mush it down and spread it out a little more there as well. Again, just trying to make sure everything is covered. A AMD 8530 CPU here again. Again, that's a 8-core, 4 gigahertz CPU, single threaded though. And important to note with AMD CPUs, at least of this generation, they are single threaded compared to Intel's multi-threaded CPUs, or hyper-threaded. Next, we're putting on the bracket here, the top bracket. This one's a little bit tricky to get down here. Got to make sure you kind of start all 4 screws before you really tighten them down. Otherwise, you're not going to get the last screw in on each side there. They are spring-loaded, and one thing to probably keep in mind, too, with this cooler, watch the RAM there. It is pretty tight. Not so bad on this system. I think maybe the board's just a little bit bigger. The RAM's a little bit farther away from the CPU. But on the $500 PC build there I did, we were actually pushing the RAM, the sticks of RAM over just a little bit. It wasn't bad, but anymore, it definitely would have been a problem. It was definitely a slight interference there. And again, using the motherboard box here to support the motherboard and CPU during installation here, really good working platform. Getting the screws evenly tightened down there. And they do tighten all the way. They are spring-loaded, so you should be able to just tighten these, at least on this particular cooler, all the way down. Next, we're prepping the case here. The case comes with 6 standoffs already installed. We needed to install the last 3 there for the wider motherboard. And this particular motherboard takes up the entire case. There is no room left with this motherboard here. So it's as big a motherboard as this case can support. I believe this is just a standard ATX board, I do believe. I could be wrong in that. I did not actually take the time to check what size board this was, but putting in the back plate here. For some reason, I think the case was maybe just a little bit bent. Guess that's what you get with a cheaper case there, but could not quite get the back plate in down. I think it was the bottom corner there. Struggled with that a little bit. Finally got it to go. I think the back plate finally kind of straightened it up there a little bit, and of course, once we get the motherboard in, it was perfectly fine. This particular motherboard has a lot of USB and just I/O on the back, so that's actually kind of a nice motherboard for this. Plugging in the power supply, or the fan there for the cooler. Plugging it right into the CPU cooler there. Of course, getting this motherboard in here was a bit fun, too. It's like, okay, which angle do we got to put it in at to actually get it to fit in? Finally got it there. And then pretty much once we get it in here, we're just going to slide it up to the back I/O there, make sure that lines up, and then put in the 9 screws to hold this board in. So it's 3 along the top, 3 down the middle, and then 3 at the bottom. And I just recorded the top ones here. And you can see we're right up, if you can see in this clip here, right up against the edge of the, I believe that's the CD-ROM, DVD-ROM drive bay there, the 5 1/4 drive bay. Oh, next the fun part, trying to separate out all these wires here. We got one for the USB header, one for the USB 3.0 header. This motherboard does support USB 3.0. And then we got the 4 plugs for the various power switch, reset switch, hard drive light, and power light. And of course, it's right at the bottom there, so it's pretty hard to see which wire went where. Finally got it figured out. I believe I did get it all right, too. I don't remember having any issues with that. And then there's also an HD audio connector as well for the front audio. So there is a headphone jack and a microphone jack on the front of this case. Pretty standard input-output there for the front of cases typically. Typically, most cases, you'll find a USB or a couple USBs, USB 3.0, and then the headphone and mic, or just audio in, audio out type jack, depending on the configuration of your audio on the motherboard or add-on card, whatever you're using. For the switches there, it doesn't matter, positive and negative, but for the lights, as far as I know, it does, so that's something to keep in mind. Kind of watch the positive, negative. They're usually marked on the motherboard somewhere. Have fun finding it, though. If you got the book, that's usually a little more helpful. Sometimes they'll have an exploded diagram there showing you what pins are for what. And then I did run the wires back behind the case there, just trying to tidy it up a little bit. Unfortunately, the one, I think it was the audio one, was too short to run it behind the case, so I do have to run it in front of everything to reach down to the bottom corner there. And, you know, again, if you had maybe a little bit shorter motherboard, you could probably get away with it. But this, again, full-length motherboard. I think it has, what, 5 full-length PCI Express slots, or 4 or 5 full-length PCI Express slots on this particular motherboard here. And then there's also a small, I forget if it's an X1 or X4, I can't quite tell from the picture here either, slot up top, and then a PCI, yes, a PCI slot down at the bottom. Now we're putting in the solid-state hard drive here. This is the 500 gig solid-state hard drive. And the best I can tell, this is the only mounting option in this case for a solid-state hard drive. I couldn't really find any other mounting places for a solid-state. If you look towards the bottom there, those can accommodate regular 3.5 hard drives. And I suppose you could mount the solid-state to that as well, but you would have nothing to hold it or support it from the opposite side. That doesn't seem like a good idea. Next, putting in the power supply here. This is a non-modular 600-watt power supply. Should have plenty of power here for this computer. And if you're not sure what power supply to get for your computer, they do have power supply calculators online. So you can just go to that, add up what components you're going to be putting into your computer, and it'll tell you what size of power supply you should get. And typically, at least for myself, I always add like 100 watts to it. That's probably not necessary, but if it tells you you need 500, I'll go to 600. Or if it tells you you need 600, I will go to 700. And just gives you a little extra room there too, you know, in case you upgrade in the future, something to keep in mind. You know, maybe when calculating it, you should calculate for future components you might want. Having a little trouble lining this power supply up in this case as well. I don't know if you can see it from the video there. If you look on the left side there, that top screw hole, it's a little bent. And then I think, was it one other one? Maybe the one I'm putting in now too, I think was a little bent here as well. Possibly a little shipping damage there. It is a little bit of a cheaper case here, but it does seem to work. And like I said, nice thing about it, it does have an intake and an exhaust fan, and they're both 120 millimeters. Sometimes you get the smaller, cheaper cases like this, they'll have smaller fans in them. And I've never been a particular fan of that. No pun intended there. But the smaller fans, they typically are more noisy. Obviously don't move as much air. And it doesn't seem like they ever last as long. Maybe it's just me, but it doesn't seem like, like the little 80 millimeter fans. They don't last very long. Of course, these are probably cheaper fans too, so they might not last very long either. Not sure. The fan in the front does have blue LEDs on it, by the way. The one in the back is not, it's just blue colored. Now we're pulling all the power supply cables through the back hole here, and then we'll run them in through the front. And there are some extra ones on this. Again, this is a non-modular power supply, so we can't plug in or remove wires that are needed versus not needed. If you recall, again, from our previous $300 and $500 PC builds, the Corsair power supplies we acquired for those actually were semi-modular. Yes, there's all the different power options there. Feeding in and just fit there, just fit with the extra motherboard power there, the 8-pin motherboard power. These are a bit fun to plug in. The 2 4-pins there, they combine to form the 8-pin, and they don't really hold together that well. In fact, there's nothing that holds them together. So you got to get them both in and try to hold them together at the same time. Sometimes on the power supplies, they'll either come separately, so you'll have a 4-pin and an 8-pin, or it seems like most commonly they like to do it this way, where they'll have it split. So if you only need the 4-pin, you can only plug the 4-pin in, but if you need the 8-pin, then you can slip them together, and usually they hold together. This one did not. I believe I'm working on getting the power there for the hard drive and the big motherboard, the 24-pin there. Again, the 24-pin comes with a 20 and an additional 4-pin with it. Again, you got to get both those in at the same time as well.
don't know why they really do that anymore. I can't say I've seen a 20-pin motherboard in like the last 15 years, so not sure why the power supplies still come that way. I don't know if anybody's ever seen a motherboard with a 20-pin power supply, but like I said, I have not seen one in a long, long time, so... There we go, got the power supply in for the motherboard. Next, we're moving on to, of course, the most important part of any gaming system. That is the graphics card. And this is a GTX 1060, a real GTX 1060. Again, it'll be interesting to see when we benchmark this, how the results compare to our semi-questionable, or no, there's nothing semi, it's completely questionable Chinesium GTX 1060. And if you watch the $500 PC build, they already know that a GTX 1050 Ti beats the Chinesium 1060 by a factor of almost, or is it better than 4? Either almost 4 or better than 4. So definitely know there's something wrong there with that. And this is pretty much the last step here as well. We're putting in the graphics card. So we're just about done building this computer here. The graphics card, by the way, is, of course, a double slot. Takes up 2 slots there. Plugging in the 6-pin power there for the graphics card. Bigger graphics cards typically take an additional power plug. Smaller ones do not. If you watch the $500 PC build there with the GTX 1050 Ti, that one did not take any additional power on it. And there we go. The system is finished here. Getting ready to boot it up for the first time.
Okay, everyone, with that concludes the building of this computer. Pretty much didn't have any troubles at all putting it together. A little bit small of a case, so of course getting everything in there at the right angle and stuff, a little bit tricky. You know, especially the motherboard there. It's a pretty tight fit with that motherboard. Even the graphics card, it's pretty tight in there. You'd probably be pretty hard pressed to actually get a hard drive. There's a hard drive bay down here. Probably be pretty hard to get a regular 3.5-inch hard drive in there. The SSD, of course, mounted up on the side like I did with the last one there. There doesn't seem to be much for SSD mounting options in this case. I'm not sure why that is. Maybe they just figured, you know, cheaper case. If you're buying this case, you're probably not getting an SSD. I don't know. But again, your case does not really affect the performance of your computer, other than maybe cooling, which actually, that's one thing I actually like about this case. It's got one, I think it's 120 millimeter fan here, and another one in the back. So it actually comes with 2 fans. You could put another 2 on the side here, it looks like, but unfortunately I don't think you could. The CPU cooler, you might be able to get one down here, maybe, but for the most part there, the CPU cooler kind of blocks those options. Either different CPU cooler or forgo the fans, which I don't think you'll need them with this case, I wouldn't think. So that just leaves installing Windows 10 yet, which I'm going to do that off camera there. I did it on camera there for the previous 2 builds, so nothing new or different there. We're just going to do the same thing. SSD, so it should install nice and quick. You can definitely tell the difference, at least I could anyway, between the system with the hard drive, the spinning platter in it, versus the system with the SSD versus install time. Definitely probably twice as quick, I would say. So anyway, I just want to say a big thanks to all the individuals that helped donate components and money for these builds here. Big thanks to those individuals. And with that, you folks have any other comments or questions about any of this, be sure to leave them below. And a reminder, giveaways will be coming up here, so stay tuned to the channel for announcements on that. So thanks for watching, and till next time.